walking in the street, people throw on you color. Yes. They wish to you have colorful life even they don't know you. This is the love festival. Yes. So my friend, just for the example, we tell you the price to understand. It's not mean we're going to tell you the price, we give you pressure, something to take it. You see, that Krishna, if you compare with this Ganesh is a more complicated, that means the weaver is more complicated than that one. That is the less color, that is the more color. So that word is...
It's all happening, 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 it's all
All right, welcome to the podcast, episode 89, If It's All Happening with Zach Leary. That's me, your host. This is the second podcast recorded to you from the inner depths, from the inner ball of wisdom and confusion and chaos and beauty that is India. And here we are bringing It's All Happening to you from India, which is a pretty wild experience, and I'm going to tell you why. The podcast itself wasn't recorded in India, but the intro is, and this is about 2 hours after, this intro is being recorded about 2 hours after something very powerful happened, which I'll explain in a minute. But this week on the podcast, this is actually going to be a joint podcast with the MAPS podcast, so that's going to come out Monday, but I thought we could basically use this live podcast that we recorded at the Psychedelic Science conference for both shows. So bear with me on that, but it features Shane Mauss, the great comedian, Pelger, the great captain extraordinaire and bon vivant of the Symposia organization, and Berra, Yazar-Klosinski, who is the clinical research scientist at MAPS, who is a wonderful human being. So there aren't many things in life that I recommend everybody try, right? Because, usually experiential phenomenon or experiences are subjective, right? And they're not for everybody. Like Jerry Garcia said about the Grateful Dead, we're kind of like licorice. Not everybody likes licorice, but when people like it, they like it a lot. So it's like that with most things that sort of fall on the experiential plane, if you will. But there are a couple things that I would argue that you'll probably be better off if you try it at least once. One of those is taking MDMA and rolling around on the ground with someone you love very much, and tell me your life isn't better after you do that. 2, go to India, go to the Kaishi-Vishwanath temple for the main darshan that happens between 5:30 and 6 p.m. every night, and then immediately afterward have your guide take you to the burning ghats. So the Kaishi-Vishwanath temple is the main Shiva temple in India. It's one of the main Shiva temples in India. And in case you don't know what Shiva is or who Shiva is the destroyer, the fierce destroyer of the ego, that if you sort of worship Shiva's energy is so powerful and comes in such a sort of a force that is based on recreation, so it can shatter your illusions of all the bullshit that you think is important in your life in order to give you a new path to create your own new reality. And so you go to this temple, and it's extremely chaotic, it's extremely dirty, it's extremely loud, it's extremely messy, but it's extremely beautiful, and it's extremely they're sort of in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of being pushed around by these old Brahmin men looking to get the darshan of the lingam, and these old Indian women dressed in saris. There's kind of a certain quiet calmness that just pervades the energy there. It sounds really weird because you are being pushed around and there are monkeys jumping all over the place and you have to show your passport to get in if you're a foreigner, and there are people asking you for money, and there are beggars, and there are people pouring milk all over the place and in a holy ceremony. But really, there's this quiet sort of burn that just permeates everything that goes on, and it's really, really, really beautiful and profound. And then after that, have your guide take you to the burning ghats, where you see bodies being burned right in front of your very eyes. And there they burn somewhere between 200 to 300 bodies a day and go as close as you can physically get, which is basically about a foot or two away from a body being burned. And you see families circumambulating the bodies 5 times, one for each element in the universe. And you watch these bodies just reincarnate into the next thing right before your very eyes. And this tradition has been going on at the banks of the Ganga in Varanasi for anywhere between 2,500 to 3,000 years. It's been going on that long, uninterrupted. And supposedly they say that there is a fire that has been burning there, that has been where they basically, it's the spark that lights the fires of the bodies that has been burning nonstop for 3,000 years. So it's a very, very, very powerful experience. And no matter what you think about any of this form of spirituality, you basically go in without judgment and just with an open mind and an open heart, and you can get a very life-changing experience. Speaking of judgment, in Sanskrit, there actually is no translation for the word judgment. That doesn't exist. But there is a word for discernment. So you can, on your own, if you think about the difference between judgment and discernment. But they are very, very different words. And that word is viveka in Sanskrit. And there's a very, very famous Swami who came to America in the early 20th century, whose name was Swami Vivekananda, which means the bliss of discernment. Now, really step aside and think about that for a second, about the bliss of discernment, and think about how that applies to your life, and separating it from judgment and your self-righteous pretenses that we basically inhabit for so many hours of the day, because all of our fears are wrapped up inside of a little ball and inside of our own chest, and then we project it in the form of judgment for others, to others. But if you step aside and get rid of that little ball, you can step into discernment and get into the bliss of discernment, and thus strip away all of the things that aren't working for you and discern what ingredients, what blocks, what constructs within the material world are going to serve you best. And that is Vivekananda. So the podcast, enjoy it. Shane Mauss, Lex Pelger, Berra from MAPS. This was recorded live at the Psychedelic Science conference. I can't even really say what this podcast is about. It's just about a lot of stuff. It was recorded at the end of the conference, so it's really kind of all-encompassing about everything that we experienced in the previous 4 days there in Oakland, California. I hope you enjoy it.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 7 of the MAPS Podcast. My name is Zach Berry. I'm your host. And starting on the right, Lex Pelger. He's the captain of everything that is no nonsense.
And
right?
I can't turn it down either.
No nonsense. And the pilot behind this symposia.
Yeah.
The symposia organization, but you're also doing the Blue Dog Tour, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Shane Mauss. Mauss. So it's all right.
It's spelled M-A-U-S-S. So. And actually, people from Germany with the same spelling pronounce it just like you did. So I pronounced my name wrong. You just pronounced it correctly.
But it's so funny. This weekend, I've heard it pronounced, I think maybe even a third way.
Yeah, I've heard several different versions, and hardly any of them are Moss.
Shane Mauss is the host of the Here We Are podcast, and are you still on a good trip tour?
Yeah.
Eventually.
Yeah, well, it was originally going to be, I thought I was going to end at 80 cities, and then I got to 80, and I was like, 100 sounds really nice. And so I added more cities, and so I'm probably wrapping up in June.
Okay, cool. And from MAPS, Berra, Yazar-Klosinski, what's your official title? The lead clinical research associate?
No, I'm a clinical research scientist at MAPS.
Clinical research scientist
I've
at
moved
MAPS.
up.
You moved up.
Yeah.
You know, your bio on the website still needs to be updated.
Thanks for telling me.
Thank you all for being here. It's really good to do this. So here we are. So where I wanted to start is, this is Sunday, sort of we're wrapping up Psychedelic Science 2017. Maybe Berra, I can start with you a little bit. I've certainly noticed some trends that I feel in this psychedelic science that maybe I didn't pick up at previous events. But tell me, what are your takeaways? What trends did you feel happening during this conference?
I feel like the field of psychedelic science is maturing and growing up. We're coming to our period where, the initial proof of principle studies are kind of a thing of the past, and now with this psychedelic science, we're featuring the studies that are replicating the initial results and expanding upon them, further exploring, mechanisms of action, effect size, safety profile, really fully characterizing risk-benefit as opposed to just saying, hey, in this small sample it worked. Now we can say in this larger sample and overall it worked.
So what qualifies a larger sample?
So for our MDMA PTSD studies, we've treated 107.
Okay.
And of those, 105 were blinded, and we have outcome data from 103.
And Lex, you've been here at the Symposia stage for the last 4 days, 4 days, whatever it's been. What do you feel like? What are you leaving? What's the buzz that you're leaving with after the psychedelic science?
A lot of excitement. It was really beautiful to see what a diverse array of voices came in. It's great to hear about all of the research going on in a lot of the other rooms, but this was a lot of information for the people who already know the truth about this and they want to learn from each other. And my favorite is always the open storytelling nights, and we had that last night from 6 to 8 and got to hear some amazing stories about how mushrooms cured someone's benzo addiction and made someone quit smoking. Even though he didn't want to quit smoking, she took a bunch of acid and all of a sudden stopped wearing black and never touched another cigarette.
That kind of reminds me of, they quit smoking accidentally, but I've also heard, people who are devout atheists, right? And all of a sudden they do a psychedelic and they're like, oh shit, I just saw the face of God. And you're like, wait, I thought you were an atheist.
Happened to me.
Happened to you.
I mean, not that I think I saw the face of God necessarily, but I definitely have shifted to agnostic.
You have?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, thanks, DMT.
And Shane, you have a really interesting perspective in that, I'd like to ask you what your kind of takeaway is from this Psychedelic Science 2017, but you're across America, kind of within everyday America in towns that most of us don't visit, more than the average person, the life that you lead. So what's going on out there?
Well, I started, this is, I think,
important.
It's really, really interesting. I didn't know what to expect before launching this tour. I'm from a small town in Wisconsin called La Crosse, Wisconsin, on the border of Minnesota and Iowa. And in my town, certainly psychedelics weren't an unheard of thing. They maybe weren't as popular as an area like Boulder or the Northwest or whatever, where you go to Portland and mushrooms are just free. They just want you to have them. And, so it wasn't quite like that, but I knew that there was these small pockets of the Midwest, but my tour went all around, everywhere. It's 100 cities. And so the Southeast I found to be a little worse in terms of audience numbers.
Okay.
But people always ask me this: how does the show go in like these small towns or in these really conservative areas? And I'll tell you, the psychedelic crowd is everywhere, and in areas like that, they don't have an outlet for it. They don't have the kinds of entertainment that they would prefer, and everyone knows what's out there because there's Netflix and YouTube, and it's a digital age, but not everyone gets that live entertainment in their town if they're in like a small conservative area. And they come out, and I mean, my show does pretty well everywhere, and sometimes it takes, because I do a solo show, and by the nature of it, it's a little slower, and it sometimes takes like 10 minutes to like really get rolling. In a smaller, like conservative area like this, the audience might be a little smaller, but they are so enthusiastic that from like the first, I haven't even finished my first joke, they're like, oh my God, he's talking about mushrooms. So definitely there's enthusiasm out way more widespread than I ever imagined. I did this show just, let's see what happens. I didn't expect it to turn into what it has.
And were you going to say something?
Yeah, so I was just going to mention that I went to the Cannabis Cup in Amsterdam with High Times and I was talking to a lot of the attendees and found a interesting like overrepresentation of folks from Texas. So I feel like you could almost use this as a tool for identifying where to have the next here we are, because you can say, all right, these people need some of this.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, not to overgeneralize it, but, you know, in towns like that are, you know, and traditionally maybe Trump country, as we would maybe call it now, right? But yet there are still these pockets of people wanting to break free, right? Is that kind of what you're seeing, Shane? People who are wanting to break free, but they just happen to live in these places?
Absolutely. I mean, I identify with these people. I was one of these people. Yeah, sure. I worked in factories and never got it. I never understood the lifestyle that I felt. For me, it was like being in a prison, like my whole life, and so. That's fucking dramatic. People in a prison do have it worse than like my Leave It to Beaver upbringing, but it did feel very limiting, and I think that I can see that in people in these areas, and maybe I just identify it with it a little more because I am that person.
Yeah, but you know, I think it's also from a socio kind of cultural lens. It's also really important because it gets us out of our echo chamber, right? We have to realize, like, you know, I live in LA, here we are in the Bay Area, but it goes much wider, you know, we're everywhere, right? Yeah.
Just wanted to add something also with those specific areas of the country. Opioid use disorders appear to be overrepresented, and you know, I think that there could be something there with the potential for psychedelics to be useful as a part of the community fabric to help control that.
Don't forget amphetamines in those areas. I did a lot of factory work, and there's a lot of monotonous jobs out there that helps to have a little pick-me-up to pay the bills.
Well, yeah, and we could spend a whole podcast talking about why the opioid epidemic has hit the people that, you know, who don't need it, you know, who are being hurt the most. There's no question about that. But what that does kind of segue into, and I'm interested in any of you guys can kind of take this, but, you know, the Psychedelic Science Conference, it is, you know, it is clinically based. You know, we're based in data, in research, in hard science, and there's no question it's extremely important because it dispels so many of the myths and the paranoia around psychedelic use. But what does that do to the recreational world? What do you think? Start with Lex.
I think this trend of normalization is really important, but it also gets it can lead us into trouble, because so often in our community especially, it's like, well, it's just weed. But you start dabbing it at really high doses, it's not just weed anymore. And it's very easy, just because, yes, MDMA, won't kill you, neurotoxicity only happens at really high levels, that doesn't mean that you can't do harm to yourself just by the psychological impact of what this drug does. Like falling in love with the wrong person because, you're at the wrong spot at the wrong time. But it makes it, I think there has to be more dialogue overall. I mean, that's what I like to see the most about the storytelling events, is what is closest to my heart, because that's where I feel the most important data is about these drugs. You can only cut up so many rats' brains before you're not learning that much more about what psilocybin does in the brain. It's the reports of people, and I've been collecting people's drug stories for maybe 10 years now as a writer, and every single one of these open mic storytelling sessions, I learned something brand new about drugs that I had never heard before. And the coolest part is, most of the time, when someone says it, I go, oh, of course, somebody could get high in that way. I just never expected it. It's like when a kid remembers, like, Mom, I remember like a year and a half having a really odd day. It's my first memory. She's like, that was actually the day I ate mushrooms for the first time since I had you, and you were still breastfeeding. So I guess, yeah, you did trip at a year and a half and have your first memory. And I never expected to hear that story, but as soon as I did, I thought, my God, that probably happens once a week in this country. And at least I got to hear about it once.
I have two completely opposite and kind of extreme views that I kind of go between when thinking about recreational and clinical. I think for me, in an ideal world, we would go to clinical first, and not just for PTSD, like just anyone can go to therapy to get help for anything, to talk through any problems, or just to talk about their life. And I don't see why there needs to be a distinction within the psychedelic field, why you necessarily need to have PTSD. And I worry about people trying to go out and get PTSD to get into one of these guys. But then after people are doing it in this kind of safe container and kind of get some sort of training, then maybe it could be a little more done recreationally, responsibly. And I don't think that it can follow the same path as weed, because weed is like, hey, we have this medicine, it's called Luke Skywalker, and it's like, what the fuck do you mean? How is that medicine? Medical gummy bears are like, I mean, look, I love I love weed candies, I do, but it's fucking silly to present it like medicine in that way. If you're I'm from like a conservative area, I know the joke that they think that is. Those are the people that need to be convinced the most, and I think those things really delegitimize what we're trying to do. And so I don't think that psychedelics can follow the same path in that way. On the other side of it, I go, I'm like, well, we focus way too much on the negative, and like you have to have like some sort of abuse or some problem that like needs to be fixed for psychedelics to like be right for you. And like, oh, what if you jump out of a window or so? Like, maybe someone's jumped out of a window on acid, and I don't really give a fuck, honestly, because credit card debt makes people jump out of windows far more than LSD ever will, and I doubt you can really say it was the LSD that did that. So I have two kind of very opposed, like one is kind of conservative and the other one's a little crazier.
Well, it's the one person who jumped off of a building thinking that they were a bird and they could fly, tripping on LSD in 1971. That's the blueprint for everyone now. Right. That's acid gone mad, man.
Well, the other famous one was Frank Olson, the CIA chemist involved with Project MK Ultra. He jumped out a window, but somehow when they did his body a couple years later, it turns out he had severe blunt force trauma to the head before he jumped out of that window, which is often how these things go.
But it is interesting, though, I think, Berra, you probably know more specific than I do, but for recreational use in California in 2018, they have gotten rid. There's no more children's candies allowed. That was part of the law that was passed. No more gummy bears, no more lollipops. Nothing that can be construed as a Scooby snack or something.
Yeah, and also I talk to people at FDA as a part of my job at MAPS, and it definitely complicates things to have lots of non-medical use, because that's where, initially MDMA was scheduled, Schedule 1, because of concerns, and we are finding that there is likely moderate abuse potential from a psychological standpoint that's self-limiting, but still there. And so, we're going to have to likely do additional studies on human abuse potential, just to, really hone in on exactly how much abuse potential, even though many of these studies have already been done to a certain extent and published. We're going to need to once again demonstrate to FDA.
But something like MDMA, let's just take MDMA, for example.
Yeah.
Does, the per capita abuse potential with MDMA, does that exceed that of alcohol, cigarettes, caffeine, or McDonald's? To me, it just seems like anything that has, a property within it that sort of makes you feel good, no matter what it is, pornography, milkshakes, salt, they all have a certain...
diversion is rampant in all of those cases.
Yes, right. So why have we, I think I know the answer to this, but, why as a society have we singled out only certain abuse potential?
We hate hedonism. We hate pleasure more than anything else. This nation hates pleasure. I grew up in the church, and
you did.
It's still in my blood. I love that all you people go out partying, but I don't want to do that. There's work to be done.
Yeah, at least when you frame it like that. We consume hedonistic amounts of sugar and salt, but just because it's not framed in that way, that's kind of a pleasure that is slipping under, and why people are usually taking too much pleasure in those things, and it's creating so much addiction. Whereas I would say that the majority of salt, sugar, and fat consumption is hedonistic rather than necessary. Whereas if you look at the amount of salt or sugar that a human needs and what they're consuming, whereas psychedelics might be the complete opposite way. If people are tripping once a year, it might be that we need more trips than that. It might kind of be necessary for well-being. It seems like it was a regular part of our evolutionary history. I don't think it's that crazy to talk about it in this way. It might be something that we're missing.
There are we could pick any indigenous culture and talk about their frequency of use, and how it was the campfire ritual. But let's talk about safety mechanisms again, just a little bit, because with generally speaking, let's just use the word drugs for a second, right? The number one kind of soundbite in our society is the children. What about the children, right? It's oh my God, you can't be near schools, the children are going to get addicted, right? But as we now know, it's not true. It's not true. So, let's start with that, though.
Sure. Yeah. So, it's really interesting that everybody's all concerned about the children. However, Dravet syndrome, for example, is a primary area where it is, what about the children? Are you literally going to let a kid have 100 seizures a day and let that keep happening? How is that ethical? And so then the legal...
Ritalin.
Yeah, in the case of Ritalin, it's interesting because in the pediatric studies, I've had to read about them.
Sure.
And so there is a lot more neuroplasticity in the brain. So any type of medication that's given, even though the abuse potential is high, they say the abuse potential is manageable later in life because the risk and the benefit ratio is justified. In the case of stimulants used for the treatment of ADHD, they're approved from age 3 and up in children. And
that sounds so insane.
I know it sounds insane. But then the alternative of untreated ADHD is that there's less blood flow to the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which leads to cognitive function deficits because it's untreated and there's, disorganization throughout the brain as a result. So then you're like weighing the pros and cons of untreated ADHD versus the reverse. So.
I actually don't like to think of my ADHD as a deficit. Thank you very much.
It served
Sorry,
you well.
neurological variance, Shane.
It has
Mauss.
served you well, Mauss. But okay, but I do feel I hear what you're saying, and like if you don't treat ADHD, it could lead to cognitive dysfunction and things like that. But hasn't there been a rise of diagnosed ADHD since like 1992 or something, and it's grown exponentially? To me, it doesn't seem like
It's also genetic factors are contributing to that rise, just like an epigenetic likely, like any other mental health issue. And, overall, there's an overall increase in mental health disorder diagnoses in the U.S. population primarily, I feel like. But it could be that these genetic and epigenetic factors are contributing to that rise.
So, growing up in the church, Lex, how did you guys view, what was kind of the company line on mental health issues? Do you recall?
They didn't exist. They were completely hidden. The manic depressiveness that ran in my family, it was still secret. My parents' generation, they would talk about it some, but it's still something that we are so ashamed of. And it's one of the things I hope will change about human society is that we get more and more like people, schizophrenia is a good example where you are somewhat in control of your actions, but not all the way. And it used to be with epilepsy, we'd say, well, you're simply possessed by the devil, and that is it. And it turns out to be a completely physiological thing. And with schizophrenia, it's such a tricky condition that it's hard to say where it stops and ends. And I think it's going to lead to the issue of, that can also be healed by a lot of these drugs, the extreme violence of the people in prison who have done very hard things that, do deserve to be there. The amount of prefrontal cortex damage they have from the deficits in early child development they get, especially in this country where we just don't care for children. There's no money for kids, and it's a hell of a shame considering that we'll dose them with drugs, we won't give food to starving children here, is that can rot the front of your brain. So you really don't have this thing that separates us from the apes. It is much less of the brain, and a really smart neurologist like Robert Sapolsky says maybe a century or two from now we'll look on systemic violence as more of a brain disease once we can look at the brain and understand where that's stemming from. It's less under that person's control than we might know now. But with the power of this classic psychedelics, ketamine, the cannabinoids to cause new brain cell growth, the stories and anecdotes from the underground are overwhelming. The number of stories of autism, nonverbal autism, completely cured at the ages of 14 or 20 years old from CBD in the case of relatives quite close to me, or someone who had a son who was 20 years old, never had a conversation with him until he took one hit of acid, and he talked with his son for the first time in his life, and the last time in his life, because his ex-wife found out, and he almost lost complete access to his son. But the medicine works. It works far greater than any of the clinical research here knows, and I think the greatest wisdom is in the underground researchers who kicked these things off, and that's the silos of knowledge that we want to be sharing the most. And it's great to see all of these different projects like Irowit and Drug Story and what we're trying to do at Symposia to capture these and pass them on to the rest of us.
But, and so much of this core work too, and what you were just saying too, Lex, really reminds me so much of the need to increase our levels of vulnerability within, not just within ourselves, but within the culture as well. Because, the symbolic representation of, like, the church not talking, whatever they were expressing, the church not talking about mental health is just not talking about personal, emotional, deep things.
I do also want to give a shout out to autism being a neurological variant, along with ADHD, and that
Why did you look at me when you said autism?
I know.
She pointed at me, and spectrum me.
Because we're completing our trial for MDMA-assisted therapy for treatment of social anxiety associated with autism. So a lot of those maybe functional improvements, such as verbal expression, that we're seeing in anecdotal reports, could be associated factors, not the autism itself, that's improving. And that's also what we observed in our study with MDMA-assisted therapy, that, the social anxiety symptoms associated with having autism were improving. However, in qualitative interviews, which is the research version of the anecdotal reports that you're talking about, participants reported still feeling on the autism spectrum themselves, however, better able to adjust to the society around them, or vice versa. The society was better able to adjust to them.
So what
after treatment?
Okay, yeah. So walk us through that treatment in that use case, because I don't know much about that one.
Yeah.
I know about the PTSD one, but I don't know about too much about this. So walk us through, how does that work?
So the basic treatment model was a 2-session treatment model with MDMA or placebo within a course of therapy.
How severe on the autism spectrum?
We did not quantify severity on the autism spectrum because the goal was to treat the social anxiety. So we used the Leibowitz Social Anxiety Scale, which is a clinical interview administered by a blinded clinician, similar to the way that we assess PTSD symptoms in the PTSD studies. A blinded clinician does an interview to assess the severity. And then we actually had repeated assessments over time and found significant preliminary results in differences between MDMA and placebo.
Interesting. Okay. And how is social anxiety? How do you measure that? What's in it?
They had to have severe social anxiety, and the assessment, essentially presents a number of scenarios. Like in this scenario, how would you react to, having to give a public speech or
I see.
things like that.
Yeah.
And so, in order to qualify, all the participants had to be above a certain cutoff of severity, which was severe social anxiety. But then the Alicia Danforth and Charlie Grob incorporated additional elements into the treatment method, including art therapy, narrative therapy, mindfulness training, coping skills, and these types of things actually, as a complete kind of harmonized package, contributed significantly to the results.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, Shane, when you're out there on the road, do you find a lot of people who are really wanting to kind of share kind of their deepest, darkest? I mean, do people are they kind of like, oh my God, I'm here in this safe place, and I have this comedian talking about these things that are on my mind. I didn't know I could talk about this anywhere. Do you find people coming up to you after the show and just kind of?
Absolutely. After my shows, the common thing is people want to ask me about drugs that I didn't talk about my show, and they want to share their own drug experiences. That's just very, very normal. But then sometimes people, for whatever reason, and I'm not sure that this shows necessarily a distinction, but as a comedian, kind of your job is making yourself vulnerable, and so I think some people really respond to that anyway. But yeah, I have people share pretty vulnerable things about themselves, especially when people hear about the medical benefits of things. Then people will share their issues with me. What do you think I could do for this? I can't answer that question for you, but people are very, very interested in this stuff out there. So I've been a comic for 13 years, and you go and you do a show at a club, you perform for a bunch of people that are out for a fun night out or whatever. They don't necessarily know who you are or whatever, and then afterwards they come out and they go, hey, nice job, that was funny, and then they're kind of on their way. This is just a very typical response. It doesn't matter who the comic is, if they're kind of unknown or not famous or whatever. This is what you're going to see outside of a comedy club. It's just this, and it's sometimes a little awkward talking with the people that do want to say something a little more. But doing this psychedelic show, there's just lines of people. It takes me forever to eventually leave the show because people just can't wait to share and can't wait to ask questions. It's a completely different thing. And for someone that has an exceptional need for validation, it's great.
Well, yeah. Well, it's inherently community-based. I mean, that's part of the culture. It's fostering community, right?
Yeah.
So the 60s, we look back on it and what we refer to now as the 1960s, right? I mean, we kind of refer to it as this massive cultural revolution that had within it a very mobilized, vocal, articulate community that changed our culture. Over the course of the last 50 years, for a variety of reasons, psychedelic research fell off. What we were calling the age of Aquarius kind of fell off, and fast forward, we just elected Donald Trump president. So something happened after the first modern psychedelic revolution. There's been other psychedelic revolutions within the history of man, but let's say the 60s was the first modern psychedelic revolution. Something happened, and we got to this point. So, I don't know if 2017 is the beginning of the next revolution. Probably not. It's probably been going on already for a little while. But with the popularity of things like this, I think this was the biggest psychedelic conference ever in the history of America, right?
I don't know if there's been any, first American, first nation people.
Right.
I don't know if we can rule that out. That's the one thing.
But with the popularity of Burning Man and things like this, so what, if you could sort of look at part of the highlights from the 60s as being a cautionary tale, where do you think, Berra, where do we stand now making sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes and how it can affect culture in the future?
I mean, we are totally in the middle of our backlash.
We're in the middle of it.
Yes. So, and then a lot of this is the information silos that you were talking about. We're speaking to our own audience here.
Yes.
And
the echo chamber.
Yeah, and a lot of what I'm trying to do is get our news into right-wing news outlets. So writing scientific press releases about our studies, and those are getting picked up by right-wing news outlets. Michael Mithoefer was on Fox News. These types of avoiding us and them analogies, really, really important. And the work that Shane's doing is basically outreach into those communities. We have to keep doing it. We're really trying hard, striving to make connections with the Department of Defense, continue connections with the Department of Defense and the VA. And, our independent rater pool for our PTSD studies are primarily recruited from the VA and from the National Center for PTSD. And the only way that people are going to listen is if we do that.
And, it also sort of becomes like a mathematical association thing. Like, do you remember, when Dick Cheney, his daughter who came out as gay, and how that changed, a little bit of the fabric within the Republican community. Oh my God, the vice president's daughter is gay. Oh my gosh, that kind of changed gay rights just a little bit. So it's the same kind of thing here. I mean, right?
And Senator McCain, his daughter is a very prominent, vocal supporter. And these conversations, that's why I love the MDMA, the movies approach, conversations at the dinner table, a mundane slice of your life that happens every day, hopefully.
Well, that's kind of like with the Blue Dot Tour, though.
Yeah, exactly.
I kind of feel like it's just your everyday kind of, here's people out in the world doing their work, telling you stories, right? I mean,
and I think part of the coming out digitally can be a really helpful way to get people started.
Coming out digitally?
Yeah.
Okay.
Putting it where everybody can see it. Aunties and uncles and friends and employers, it can be a hard thing to do. But if you can get away with it, the hashtag psychedelics because is backed by MAPS and Symposium, a lot of other big drug organizations. And the whole idea is let people know. That's how you normalize it, that you use these medicines and they helped you. And maybe that'll help. Maybe they'll start looking up and maybe they'll find out that Sanjay Gupta, that nice young doctor on the TV, really believes in this medicine. Or maybe they'll find out about some of the work of MAPS. And my hope is you come out digitally and then you start to get people together in groups. And I really think small groups of people is what truly changes the world. That's why I love organizations like SSDP, where they just have these young activists and they spin off these organizations that just powerhouse through and somehow spread the word, try to change things, some kind of strong activism. But sharing on Facebook only goes so far. We need to be in person, looking each other's eyes, smelling each other's skin, and it helps. It helps normalize us. It helps build community and strengthen all of us.
Well, and with small groups, and also like one huge revelatory experience. Like Shane, maybe I don't know your story completely, but was it just one experience that kind of set you on this tour, on the good trip? Like, when did you decide that you were just going to like go on this theme tour?
I've known almost my whole career that eventually I'd be doing a show about psychedelics.
Oh, you were? You did?
I actually just thought I would be doing it much later in my life. I was just kind of nervous to out myself as I mean, I'm still actually quite nervous about becoming like the psychedelic comedian. That's not really what my aim is. I'm interested in and exploring ideas and how life works. I have a science podcast called Here We Are. I just had Robert Sapolsky on, recorded like 2 days ago.
I took 2 classes from Sapolsky at Stanford. Yeah, he's like my hero.
Best. We should just be talking about how amazing Robert Sapolsky is for the duration of the rest of the show. But I think that I worry about becoming too evangelical about the message of psychedelics because it can create a belief system. And once it's a belief system, then people are going to kind of view it as a threat to their own pre-existing systems. And I think that there's more nuanced approaches. Like most people not that long ago were against marijuana. I mean, I think still the majority of people not even a decade or 2 ago in surveys. Yeah. But you can introduce something like, hey, do you know this CBD stuff can be good for treating pain? And like, oh, I didn't know about that. Rather than being like, everyone should smoke weed all the time, and it should be legal and it should be fucking legal everywhere. But it's like you kind of go, let's be careful. If the goal is to change people's minds, then you definitely have to be careful about that, because it's fun to like hang out with a bunch of psychedelic people and like really fucking let loose and share our like full opinions and the ideas that we're excited about. But I think trying to get the message to infiltrate more of the public is going to take a little bit more nuance.
Yeah, and let's also not forget that digitally coming out remains a huge risk for folks who are on a visa or trying to become naturalized, whatever the hell that means.
Or your employer.
Your employer,
No, I mean, this is the power. What Shane, you were just talking to me, this is one of the great benefits of the microdosing revolution to me, because, the psychedelic community can be very proselytizing. We're like, oh my God, my mind was blown, and our lifestyles can become so radically different than quote unquote the norm. But the microdosing LSD revolution is just like it's not disrupting like the economic factors; it's enhancing them. It's not disrupting industry; it's enhancing industry.
With Ibogaine, I was working with Jeff Noller from New Zealand on the Ibogaine publication that just got published, and did some background research of reviews, etc. And Ibogaine in France was used as a enhancement drug in microdoses, as marketed under the trade name Lamborine.
Oh, interesting.
Quite some time. So this is not a new concept. We're just remembering it.
Yeah, and as long as we can sort of like find the way where we're not disrupting or getting away with mysticism, because the great American thing is like, industry, economics. Oh my gosh, forget mysticism, economics. And so we don't want to go too far.
And the thing to remember about all of these drugs, like my buddy Dimitri Mogianis, the great anarchist, said, the thing to remember about psychedelics is it makes sociopaths much better sociopaths.
The great anarchist. I haven't heard anybody say that in a long time.
He's a big Ibogaine activist that has a great angle on these things. Because I think the way to legitimize it in so many ways is to be honest about the harms. Nobody wants to listen to one-sided things that just aren't believable. believable. You need to say,
of course,
you have to. That's how you make people believe you on any of these drugs. And I mean, my main thing. You talked about CBD. My main mission in life is weed for grandmas, and that's why I'm writing all of this. And I think CBD is a great gateway drug for grandmas getting into medical marijuana. This works so well that they might be willing to try a little bit of THC that can help for a lot of different things. But I'm writing a 135-chapter book on all of the diseases of aging that marijuana is well proven for, from the anecdotal evidence and the preclinical and all of that.
A 135-chapter book that is juxtaposed against Moby Dick.
Well, it's the only thing big enough to fit in the human story of cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. And what I'm trying to do in there is collect every harm I can find about weed, from all the preclinical work in rats and all the terrible stories I've heard over the years from stoners who got in a really bad situation. We all know somebody who had awful times, and there are people who have had mental health breaks from marijuana that probably never would have had one otherwise, and they never came back. That needs to be talked about. This is not an innocuous drug. On the flip side, it's a miracle drug, and I can say that I think as a solid biochemist, the evidence for cannabis for the diseases of aging is the closest thing we have to a panacea for that. And there are lots of risks, but to make them believe this giant pile of evidence over here, I need to let them know about the moderate pile of risks over here that can be increased with really heavy use.
Side effects may include like thinking too much too.
Guilty.
Increased ruminations, private worries. These are actually on our list of side effects that we collected for our studies.
You may give out an inappropriate hug from time to time.
That's one of the great.
It can be kind of gross. So another thing I want to mention is that as we're approaching potential, NDA and marketing for MDMA or psilocybin, etc. Every single soundbite is going to need to have a balance of benefit and harm in it, and so that should be everyone's organizing principle when having a conversation.
Yes.
I totally agree.
But, back to the original point in this podcast, to me, it's just like the risks. Part of our mission here is to dispel the myth, the risks in a way to make them, to get rid of the paranoia, to make them, yes, they're mild, they're manageable, but there isn't some huge, crazy jump off of a building paranoia.
Well, let's be honest, we're talking about fear of the unknown.
We're talking
right?
About,
if you don't mention it,
we're talking about fear of the unknown, and I never really used to think this, but we are talking about a fear of expanded consciousness. That's always been, I think, at the forefront of this, right?
That's why I can't get my father to try them as much. And he's the smartest Christian I know. But he's like, I kind of got there with the Jesus thing, and he kind of did.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's a legitimate. I'm like, but if you're really there, then mushrooms aren't going to screw you up. What are you scared of? They're just going to confirm it.
That's all completely okay, as long as he doesn't think that you don't have the right.
No, he's good on that.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. So what I wanted to close with, I just wanted to kind of go down the line and talk about, Berra, we can start with you. What is the most, what's the most promising aspect of psychedelic research that you see within the next 10 years? Does it end in like legalization, or just what really gets you?
I really don't see legalization happening in the next 10 years. Probably in the next 5 years, we're hoping to get FDA approval for medical use of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. Soon after, we're going to start our pediatric studies, most likely, to explore effects in adolescents, and looking at ethically, safely conducting those studies in a manner worked out with FDA. And then after that, we hope to expand to parallel indications. So this would include potentially social anxiety, OCD, possibly eating disorders, substance use disorders, alcohol use disorders, wide open playing field, because these are all chronic psychiatric problems that are insufficiently treated with current tools.
Does that change the scheduling of the drug is in a recreational sense?
Well, not in a recreational sense. Like, it would probably be Schedule 2 for medical use, and we would have to work out a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy with FDA for very controlled marketing.
Okay. So the question for Shane or Lex can also be just the most promising aspect within our culture, within society. Where do you want to see psychedelics go?
I think that there is a lot of opportunity with psychedelics to gain a better understanding of how the brain, how the mind works. This is not just in a therapy sense of like discovering some repressed memory or something, but actually I think that neuroscientists could be using this as a tool to better understand how we're able to put together this perception. This is, it fits in very well with the history of neuroscience, which starts off with brain damage and having a piece of the brain missing from some shrapnel in a war or something, and it changes the behavior. So then you go, oh, well, maybe that part of the brain has something to do with this behavior, and then we isolate things and we figure out how you can stick magnets in people's heads and dampen a region first. That's a transcranial magnet, not just like a fridge magnet. Psychedelics are doing the same sorts of things in the brain. They're increasing blood flow to some regions, decreasing it to others, creating new connections. I mean, I think synesthesia is a fascinating idea that maybe we won't have to just find the rare synesthete here and there to examine. Maybe we'll be able to induce lots of synesthesia in lots of different people, and I think we could understand a lot, and we might even find out that these parts of the brain maybe don't need to be as separate. Maybe this is just a leftover from having had to do that early on in the mind. This synaptic pruning stuff to make information easier to categorize, and then once it was done, it was kind of done. We might find out that we're able to create new connections in the mind in a healthy way and hijack evolution.
And I like it.
I mean, I'm just talking about this is the potential for these things. I'm not saying that's going to happen in the next few years.
Hijack evolution.
That's good. Nice. And I'd say my biggest hope for the clinical research and all the research is sitting right here in this room. I guess for all you sitting at home, just to let you know, it's a beautiful scene. We're surrounded by art and lots of lovely people, young people and our elders and babies and dogs and a tea house. And everyone here is a minister who's going to go out and let people know about all these good experiences they had, but also about the dark ones that came out of this. And I think it's one of the parts that's, it's not the science that changes hearts and minds, it's the stories. And these are the people telling the stories. And Plato said those who tell the stories change society. And luckily, we have this internet that's going to break through this part of the big hold we've had, and it'll be more democratic. It'll be easier now, I hope, to find the others.
So go out and tell stories, everybody. Okay, so this is the MAPS Podcast. This will be episode number 7 of the MAPS Podcast, so it'll come out in a couple weeks, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and all your podcast places. And that's what it's called. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.